first thing we're going to do, like we've been doing the past month, doing just a quick little word about our Israel trip a year from now. And today we're really blessed to have Russ Goodman of Faith-Based Expeditions, who sponsored and led and our tour director from last trip, and is doing that same trip again. And I have so much confidence in him and so thankful for his partnership. So I want Russ just to greet you, share a few things, give you a little bit of teaser maybe to come back after the late service and check out the information on the trip and ask whatever questions you have. So Russ, welcome. Why don't you say a word for us?
Thank you very much. Again, it's good to be back up here. I'm actually from here, from Seattle, Washington. We were up here about 30 years. I still hate your weather. So it's I live down in Atlanta, Georgia, and so our weather's a little bit different than what you're going through. Anyway, I just got back Friday night from Israel, and from my 77th trip over the last 20 years. And I will tell you that going to Israel, for me, never gets old. If it did, honestly, I wouldn't do this business. From my standpoint, this is a family business. And like I said, we've been doing it for 20 years. And it's really become our ministry. The reason it's our ministry, rather than a business for us, is because we see what effect it has on people's lives. No matter what age, no matter where you are in your walk with God, it affects you differently. But as I said in the first service, when I addressed the congregation, when I first started doing this trip, when I was reading the Bible, and I was not very good at it at that time, I was not a Christian at that time, the words on the Bible were flat to me. They were just colorless. And after doing this for 20 years, and after going on the number of trips that I've gone to with people like Bill and other pastors who have led these trips, the words no longer are flat for me. They're no longer black. They have color. They stand out. They're three-dimensional. And it has been an enormous, enormous attribute for my study in Christ and the word that he put out before us. Walking the lands where he walked, learning about how he taught and he healed, the people he affected, has made a difference to me and the thousands of people that we've taken over the last 20 years. And like I said, because this will be a ministry, no longer a job for us, I find it more rewarding for me to watch people and how they respond to what they experience on a trip like this. It is literally life-changing. And you can talk to high school kids who go, that come back, that are more fired up about the Word and the church than I've ever seen before, to a person who's in their 90s. It's never too young and it's never too late. So from my standpoint, I hope that if you're thinking about going, that you seriously consider it strongly, and that it can be something no matter how old you are or how young you are. It will affect you tremendously as you start reading your Bible and for your ministry of your own life. So
beautiful. Thank you, Russ, so much. Appreciate it. So great to have you here. I can tell you, I just want to thank Russ publicly. I've thanked him many times that, you know, when you get to Israel, you have a tour, a guide, a local person, but Russ is accompanying us, just made all the difference. And I also want you to know, one of our people who spoke last week, I think it was Lisa, mentioned that she had talked to someone who went with a different group and different church, and they just signed up and then they went. And when they came back, it was a great trip, but it was just a wash. You know, you know, the tourism, because there's so many people there, it just kind of overwhelmed them. And I can tell you that our experience with the great connections Faith-Based Expeditions has there in Israel, that we navigated that beautifully, and then all the prep. If you didn't know this, Faith-Based Expeditions sent me to Israel, paid for my whole trip before I took our group. So, and I couldn't have led a group without that. So, I mean, it really does make a difference. I'll just simply say, for me, it makes your faith more concrete to get rooted in the land and the ground. So anyway, I know it's a significant investment, and if you're able to think about that, that'd be great. I know I'm interested in looking at trying to get some scholarships for some of our younger people to go, and I haven't even talked to Julie about that, but I'm thinking about how we could maybe put our heads around that as I think about that. So anyway, thank you, Russ. Great to have you here. All right, I need mic runners today. All right, here's one. How many people went to the Fragments of Truth movie? Raise your hand. All right, how many people didn't, which is fine. It's no shame. I just need to know so I can... All right, a little over half of you got to see it. I mainly want to give you an opportunity to say, well, what about this? What about this? This is what I really like. This is what I didn't like. Or this is what I'm confused about. But obviously, I want to set this up so that you understand what the film was about. This film was put out by Faith Life, in partnership with Faith Life, which does the Logos Bible study program that I use a lot and I teach with, and which you're looking at a portion of. And the question that this film, it's a documentary, addresses is the New Testament that you have, and we've got a bunch of Bibles over there, and I know grab a Bible for me, Don, while you're there, up in the left, top left, right in there. Just grab one. Is your New Testament that you have in your English Bible, is there some confidence that you can have that it's a true reflection of what the original authors wrote? That's the question. If you didn't know that there are many, people in academia, kind of Bible scholar folks, I guess that's what you would describe them, who have come to the conclusion and are teaching very vigorously and very out there, outgoing, very aggressively teaching that you cannot have dependence, you cannot be confident. That, and this is the way the story goes. Well, there's an original autograph. That's the original writing. So let's take the Apostle Paul, for instance. When he wrote, he didn't actually write, he dictated. And there's a couple of his letters where at the ends he says, see what large writing, because he signs it. So, but Paul did, he would have a scribe write his letter and it would be sent out. Now, the way the story goes, or the way is that, okay, this letter went out to Corinth. Well, they didn't know it was going to be scripture or whatever, and so it starts to become popular, and then this person makes a copy, and then this person, that only lasts 10 years, because it's papyrus, after all, and, it's paper. How long does your paper last? I don't know. And then, oh, I forgot, there's something in my office. Lynn, can I give you in my office, by my lampshade, is a piece of papyrus. It's from Egypt. I'd like you to get that. So, thank you. So, it was written on papyrus, and so then that got copied, and people made errors, because these were New Testament, these were fledgling Christian people, they couldn't afford professional scribes. So they were probably not very good at their writing, their transcribing. And so then that copy of a copy got copied, and those errors just keep getting passed on, and then new errors keep passing on. And then some of the scribes maybe didn't like what Paul said, so they changed some of that. And so on you go. And so to the point where when we start seeing full copies of original manuscripts, or not original manuscripts, full copies of biblical manuscripts, say in the 3rd century or 4th century, that there were so many problems that happened leading up to that, is that just a spill or did somebody fall? No, spill, okay. That scared me for a minute. So many copies that you can't depend, there's no reliability. The person that's most famous now for championing this view is a guy named Bart Ehrman. How many people have heard of him? How many of you have ever seen the Great Courses stuff that you can get online? Okay, a few of you. Okay, Bart Ehrman does all their courses. So thank you. Perfect. We're going to pass this around. This is not a biblical manuscript, but this is a piece of papyrus from Egypt. It's got a little symbol on it. Somebody bought it when they were in Egypt. And I thought I'd just pass it around so you can see. Papyrus, they would take the strands of the plant and then put it both ways, and they pound it to get it to fuse together, and that's how they made paper. And so you can pass that around so you can see what a new piece of papyrus looks like. That's not 2,000 years old. So Bart Ehrman is the one that's championing this. I have talked to people in this congregation who grew up in this congregation that no longer go to church because they read Bart Ehrman's book and they believe what he said. I have talked to other young people who go off into academia, into college, who sit down and listen in a comparative religion class, and not just in our school, it's actually even more so in our religious schools, and come back saying, you know, we really can't trust that what the Gospel of Mark says Jesus did, or what he said, or what Paul said, he said, because there's been so many years and so many problems as it got passed on. So obviously this Fragments of Truth film addressed that, and I can't imagine they won't release it, and we'll want to show it again for everybody to see. I think it's a great answer. But I want to just show you a little bit of what I have in my Greek New Testament. And also show you a little bit of the manuscripts that we have. See if I can get it up here. Get it pulled up here. Not those. Not those. Sorry. I thought I had this set up. Manuscript Explorer. Oh, come on, spell Bill. All right, this is what I want. Okay, let's take that and make that a little big. Okay, so what you can see up here, I'll make it a little bigger so you can see it. What this shows me is all the different manuscripts that we have of the New Testament that go back into antiquity. So think of pre-printing press. So 500 years ago and back. This tells us all of the, this is the Septuagint Manuscript Explorer. This is not what I want. Okay? Manuscript Explorer. New Testament Manuscript Explorer. There we go. All right. I was like, that's not looking right. All right. So, what you have here is a list. They've titled them all, and you can see, if you can do some math, that there are over close to 5,000 manuscripts that we would say are used to translate your English Bible. But of course, the oldest ones are what we're most interested in. So I just want to come down here, and I'm going to press this button to show you by century. So let's start with the 2nd century. So these are little fragments, and the P up here, can you see that? That's papyrus, and each papyrus is named, like 52 or something like that. And then P57 and P90. And these sometimes are just tiny little pieces of papyrus. How many, those of you who saw the movie, what's the oldest papyrus we have? Remember what it's called? The Ryland Fragment. Beautiful, because it's held in Manchester, England. And it's about the size, it's about that big. And it's got a portion of the Gospel of John, the 18th chapter. It's where Pilate's interviewing Jesus. And, it's on one side of it has one part of John, and the other side has another. So it tells us what? It was a book. Now that's interesting. Guess what the date of this little stamp is? Postage size stamp of the Gospel of John. They dated it to the 2nd century. You know what? So I always get confused when they say 2nd century, but that means like 100 to 200 AD. Most people, when they look at the Rylands fragment, talk about no later than 140 AD. Some want to push it back even to 110 or so. So, interesting. Now, it's not the whole of the Gospel of John, but it is a little segment. So we can compare that little segment from the 2nd century, let's say 140 AD, to a full Gospel of John that we have from the 4th century, 300 AD. And so we can compare those. And even just that little segment, we can see, wow, it's the same Gospel of John that this one is over here. Bart Ehrman will say that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of errors and discrepancies between all the different manuscripts. Those of you who were at the movie, do you remember how many, 40,000 lines, something like that, of text in the New Testament? What did they say? How many lines had discrepancies, problems? If you were to total it all up, only 40 lines out of 40,000. My own opinion is Bart Ehrman makes much to do of nothing, but to a lot of people who didn't know, who thought that the Greek New Testament floated down from heaven in a parachute, and then we just made all these copies, it disrupts people's faith and it disrupts their confidence in the New Testament. But shame on me for not telling you how it happens. So in my Greek New Testament, this is not the Greek New Testament, but I've got the text up here, like this Bible, and then down here, like some study Bibles have, where they have notes, I have a little apparatus, they call it, that tells me every place that there's a significant difference in another manuscript. Is that a secret? Well, I haven't told you that. But evidently you need to know that, because there are some people that are saying all those little discrepancies tell you that you cannot trust this translation. Let me say a couple more words and then, so I'm just trying to get everybody on the same page, and then I just really want to hear, what did you find helpful from the movie? What didn't you find helpful? I know it's just a few days ago. You think you can remember still? So if we go down here a little bit, I'm going to go back to all here. And I want to go to the papyrus. So I'm going to go back up and we're going to pick the Majuscule. And so this tells me all of the, so we have 286, and these are going to, of papyrus, not Majuscules, they wrote all in caps. So and then they started later on, as time went on, using lowercase. So we can date things by the style of writing. And how do we know that? Some of you went to the movie. Well, we have other Greek literature, and we notice how the script and style changes over the centuries. And some of those have dates on them, like they're letters from Roman emperors or from other people. And so we know this style goes with this date. Well, we look at the New Testament writings, and we say, oh, this manuscript is all in caps, and it has this kind of style, and it's just like this one of this date. And then, so that helps us date it. You don't typically want to carbon date manuscripts. Why?
Destroy it.
Yeah, well, you have to burn them. You have to get carbon date. You have to take pieces of them, burn. When you have a stamp this big of a papyrus manuscript, you don't want to do that. Some of them have been, but we don't really need it. So let me just go down here. I want to pick out, let's see, I want to go to the 4th century. So in the movie you heard about this Codex Sinaiticus. This is actually on the little alpha symbol there in Hebrew, it's what it looks like. But this is the Sinaiticus symbol. It's a handwritten on animal skin, and it's the entire Greek Old Testament and New Testament, and it was found 100 years ago. So it's one of the most important. There's another one in the Vatican called Codex Vaticanus, And the movie talks about that one as well. But these are dated roughly 300 to 350 AD. And so that's where we have completed Bibles. I got to see in Ireland when I was at the Chester Beatty Museum, and they highlighted this one in the movie, and I was like, yeah, I was there. I got to see, let me just...
Pastor Bill, could you highlight some of that information?
Yes, because it's hard to see when it's highlighted.
Thank you.
There.
Oh,
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so this lists some of the 4th century manuscripts, and it's unfortunate that I have to, for some reason my coverage is flipping over here. Well, maybe if I go down this way and make it a little smaller. Even though that's harder for you to see, so these are all 4th century manuscripts, and this is Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. These are the symbols for them. But we have all of these that are from the 4th century, so we start to get a lot of biblical evidence for the New Testament from the 4th century on. And when a scholar gets together and says, now let's see, I want to translate, John 10, they look at every one of these. And if there's significant discrepancies, they make a decision. Okay, wait, this one has, instead of the word it has they, or I don't know. And so they have to decide which one is the right one to do. Now, Bruce Metzger, who was the teacher of Bart Ehrman, says that of all the differences in biblical manuscripts, less than 1% has anything to do with any significant belief or doctrine of the Christian faith. So, okay, anyway, so I want to put that up. Now let's just get to your questions and your comments, because that's really what I think is helpful. Greg, you were going to...
Which one of those manuscripts has the all y'all in it?
Well, there you go. See, that's why you need to know a little bit of Greek. So that's good. All right, good. Bill.
In using the study Bible, we frequently have comments in there about, different texts saying this, that, and the other.
Yes.
And I don't remember coming across anything that I thought was significant, what you say.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of something that might be, at least on the verge of being significant?
Yes. So in the film, they highlighted 2. The one I'll mention is your beloved story of Jesus saying to the crowd that's going to stone the prostitute. And what does he say? Let the one without sin. That story is not in our oldest, most dependable manuscripts. At some point, it gets added. This is without a doubt. Now, the question is, would Jesus have said it? And maybe it came in through another tradition later on. But that is probably the story that you know the most. That's the most significant. That's a significant one. Now, but here's the question. Okay, take that out of our Bible. Does Jesus still forgive sin? Would he still... it doesn't... Even though it's a very important story and a powerful story, do we have other scriptures that would give us the same message? And the answer is yes. So, okay, wow. That one comes in later, and can be scholars can debate whether it should or shouldn't be in there. The other big one is at the end of the Gospel of Mark. The oldest and most reliable manuscripts end with the 8th verse where it says, the women ran away afraid and said nothing to anyone. That's it. In later manuscripts, newer manuscripts, we see endings start to appear. And when you look at the longer ending, and if you have a critical Bible or one with notes and stuff, it usually will mention this. It'll say some authorities do not. Some authorities have this short ending. It's like 3 verses, and others have like another, 14 verses or something like that. It's called the longer ending in Mark. So that is, you could check it out and see if your Bible lists it that way. So that is there because there are later manuscripts that have this different ending, and the earliest ones, though, it ends with the women ran away afraid. So of course then, scholars have to wonder, well, why did he really end his gospel that way, and why would he do that? And of course, when you look at the longer ending of Mark, that's not well attested, or not as well attested as the verse 8, just the cutoff right there. You look at it and you go, well, they clearly took the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Luke and made an ending. I mean, if you know those other Gospels, because it's like, there's got to be an ending here. So they did that. And so for many years, the Gospel of Mark was passed along with that longer ending. When we look at the best manuscripts that we have, especially in the recent finds, Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and others, it does not have that ending. And so, in your English Bible, Bill, does yours note that way?
It has it. It notes some. It has a note about some early manuscripts. Other ancient witnesses do not have that.
Yes.
I have a note in here. One of the things I did was, my son gave me a book on the Textus Receptus, which is one of the early English translations.
Yep.
And so wherever there were differences, I made notes in the
Yep.
Bible. And the Textus Receptus includes that
Right.
there in their version, which
Yep.
is interesting.
Yes. So, our Airmen makes a big deal about these stories. I think you should know about them so that you can decide, wow, does that fracture my confidence, in the New Testament? For me, it doesn't. But okay, more questions, more comments. Please, up here, folks. Scott?
That's Textus Receptus.
Textus Receptus.
Receptus, yeah. Was that the one that was used for the King James translation?
You're getting out of my my wheelhouse. I know that they use I know they talked about this in the film. I think it's called.
I think they
Here's
said
my
that that
point.
is something Greek, I think.
Well, it's one of the. It's like Codex Vaticanus. Basi, I think it's called, that they use. That was the big one that they used. So,
Well, here's my point in the question, is
Yeah.
that particular thing, the end of Mark, I think I had told you before, I was having a bit of a debate about, somebody said that people are removing parts of they're trying to prove that the New Testament isn't accurate because parts have been removed.
right.
And I said, no, that part has been added because the oldest manuscripts don't have that.
That's correct.
But I think that the one that he had mentioned is what the King James may have come from. And so that was the basis of a lot of doctrine, was that King James version. And so that part is pretty important as a distinction.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's talk about the King James version just a bit. How old is it? When was it created?
1611?
1611, something like that. I think that's what I remember. Yep. They took the manuscripts they had available, which were very good, and translated it into English. I always used to think it was translated from Latin to English, but no, they had Greek manuscripts. Now we have a lot more that they didn't have 500 years ago. And we employ those in addition, and so now we have some newer translations that do differ from the King James Bible a little bit. Not radically. I bet you if I just took a King James and took a Revised Standard Version and read a verse, you would say, oh, well, that's the same verses. Of course, the King James Bible is very, it's a literary work of art, and it's the basis for so much of our English literature. If you love the King James Bible, you should get a New King James Bible. They call it the New King James because English changes meaning. A word in English 200 years ago doesn't mean the same thing. It's the same English word, but now it means something different. That's why you need a New King James Version. A lot of people believe that the King James Version was inspired like it was like a divinely inspired translation. So that's why the church is like, only the King James Bible. Well, I always like to say, well, shouldn't you use the best manuscripts? You know, but they kind of have this belief that, you know, it's like the legend of the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. 70 AD or so, 70 BC or so, people need the Old Testament in Greek, so we're going to have a translation of the Hebrew into Greek, so people can read the Old Testament still, because they don't speak Hebrew anymore. Or they can't read Hebrew anymore. So we're going to have a Greek translation of the Old Testament. Well, the legend is that 70 scholars got together, they did their own separate translation, and they compared them, and they were identical. Now, do you believe that? I don't know. Go on. But the essence of what's being said is that this is a divinely inspired translation that you can count on. For me, my counting on my English translation is that God has provided a witness over the centuries in all these manuscripts that is very sufficient to bring us the original. But that's not perfect. There are discrepancies and there are differences, and I love that. I think that's exciting and interesting. But for some people, I've actually talked to Christians that feel like the even the NIV, New International Version, which is like kind of trying to pervert the faith or something, because it's going away from the King James Bible. Some people have this kind of divinely inspired belief in the King James Bible. I don't. But I think it's a beautiful translation. It's the basis for the English language. It's beautiful. Some scriptures just you got to read from the King James Bible. You know, it's just beautiful. But anyway, so that's really what I would say about that. Let's keep going. More points from the movie of interest or questions. Yes?
2 points that I was very interested in. I was always under the impression that there was no original scripts around before 400 BC. Everything was copies. But it was interesting, the movie addressed it that the original scripts or holographic copy were around until about 700 or 800 BC. And the other is...
You mean AD.
AD.
Yeah.
And the other one was how the Bible was created, you know, how the Council of Nicene created the Bible. It was simply taking all the books that they agreed on and put them together.
Thank you, Warren. That's a great, I'm glad you brought up those 2 points. So, what Warren is referring to is that there was an old belief that the autograph would disappear fairly quickly, the original. Well, one, we know for sure that some originals were copied right at that moment. Paul said in Ephesians, here's a fun little fact from ancient manuscripts. The book of Ephesians, the letter of Ephesians, in the oldest manuscripts, it doesn't say to the Ephesians. It's just open-ended. But later manuscripts, it lists, this is the letter to the Ephesians. Most people explain this is that this was a circular letter that Paul wrote to a lot of places. And so it was a general letter. So there's more. So it's not like, okay, here's the original right here, and then he sends it to Ephesus, and then they make some copies of that and pass it along. No, they would have made a bunch of copies right away. So that's a great point. Now, how long did those last? This is the thing that Dr. Evans in the film really uses to combat Bart Ehrman's position. We found a library in Egypt where the originals were still in use 200 years after they were created. So those papyri, those manuscripts, were kept around and used for 200 years. So people say, well, how long? And they also make the point that the Bishop Peter, 200 years or so later, refers and says, you know what? You can go and look at the original of the Gospel of John. He's writing 200 years later. We actually have this written down. Go look at the autograph of the Gospel of John. I think it's in Ephesus. So he makes a point that it was 200 years after Christ. It's the original of the Gospel of John is still around. They were not too quick to throw them in the recycle bin. Exactly. So this is kind of, when they found this library, it's a secular library where they found all these writings that had been preserved and kept around for all this time, it made people totally rethink the copying and passing on process. That, you know, a copy could last a long time. Well, we've got some that we've still found, you know, that go back 1,800 years from today. But as far as they're being used, and you know, the assumption was that, well, they get used up and messed up, and you know, well, it seems like they were much clearer about that. By the way, another thing that we find out when we look at these ancient of manuscripts, like you look at the P46, which is in Chester Beatty Museum, has all the Gospels pretty much, not complete, but in most of Paul's letters, I got to look. It was on display, Paul's ancient hymn, you know, have this mind in yourself that was in Christ Jesus, that even though he was equal to God, did not count that equality as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of the servant. So God highly exalted him, and it goes on. And it's a poem, and I got to see that leaflet. That's the oldest piece of papyrus that we have of that scripture in a book form. So these things lasted, they were used, and they took great care. And when we look at the script, it was professionally done. Not to the point where it was like calligraphy, but it was professionally done. This was not amateurs. And we do find some manuscripts that were clearly not done by professionals, and we see that they go back and they reread, and they say, I made a mistake here, and they fix it in the margin. So even though they weren't a professional scribe, they were very attentive to what they were doing. So thank you for mentioning that particular one, that not only the autographs, but the copies were kept in use for a long time. So, you know, okay, I'm a scribe, and I'm writing in 400 AD. I've got these manuscripts before me. That scribe can look at the differences, because they're going to have them. It's not like what that scribe was copying was 10 years ago. What they were using might have been around for hundreds of years. So that was really powerful. Your second point I wanted to talk about, which was
the Bible, how was the Nicene Creed?
The Nicene Creed. So, or the Council of Nicaea. So this is very important to get in your heads. The Da Vinci Code says that a bunch of gray-haired old men in the secret back room decided what Gospels were in and what Gospels were out, and all of this. Total lie. Total lie. It's just a total fabrication. The canon was not formed in the Council of Nicaea. Officially, it wasn't formed in the council until the Council of Carthage, way later in that century, close to 400 AD. But at the Council of Nicaea, Constantine did say, look, we need to have a set of books. We got all these books running around. So what he did is he said, I want to get together so I can send out into all the empire, you know, a list of the books. Well, when they got together, there was no official, these are the books. So what did they do? They took the books that were generally accepted, there was no argument about, and made up all kinds of these. In fact, it may be that the Codex Sinaiticus might have been one of those. I mean, it goes back to the, 4th century, to the 300s. And so they pulled together the books that Christians were reading. And there were no argument on them. There's a few books that they argued about, 2nd Peter, Jude, some others that they weren't sure they were authentic, or maybe they go back. But there was such a consensus of what books were in that all the bishops from all the area could say, okay, these are the books. They copied them out, and they sent them out. So that's what happened at the Council of Nicaea. Mainly what they were working with at the Council of Nicaea is what you confessed this morning in the Nicene Creed, the relationship of the Holy Trinity. That Jesus is eternally begotten of God and is not a secondary God, which is what the Latter-day Saints teach, a little bit like what Islam would say, that Jesus is, they would just say he's a prophet, he's not God. So anyway, so they were they were battling and trying to figure that one out. But they did send out the kind of generally accepted books of the Bible, and because there was no controversy about it. You know, all these secret gospels that you've heard about, which are interesting and fascinating, and you should read the Gospel of Thomas, read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, whatever, see if you can make sense of it. These were not accepted as the primary books. The church, just by use. So don't let anybody tell you that a bunch of gray-haired old men secretly, you know, chose these books and put down all these other books that everybody loved. You know, that's just a fabrication. That's actually, just to be straightforward, that's a lie. And it's on A&E, Smithsonian, on and on and on. History Channel. Bart Airmen, every time I turn on the TV, he's there. Okay, let's keep going. Yes, other things. So thank you for those 2 points, Warren. Those are great.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier, just briefly, was as a scribe was transcribing the text,
Yes.
and noticed an error or a conflict, made a note in the margin.
Yes.
Were any of these notes incorporated in what we're reading now?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because
Or are they footnotes?
they might be a footnote, because another manuscript might have it the way that it even corrected or something. But scholars, when they look at that, they take those corrections absolutely in hand. Didn't the movie highlight one of the, either Codex Vaticanus or Sinaiticus, that actually, these were so precious that they actually re-inked them. They went detail over and they actually did each one. And when they did that, we find that there were some, they made some corrections. And so we can actually see the 2 different ways that they did it. And so they definitely take those into account. Where are we at? Back, Terry, right behind you, John. And then Brent, if you can come up to Alan up here in the front left. Terry, and then we'll, yeah.
Pastor Bill, I just wanted to make 2 quick points.
Please.
I love the fact that they did the comparison to secular classics.
Yes.
And how there are big 800 and 1,000 year gaps.
Yes.
But those are accepted as gospel.
Yes.
I thought that was very telling.
That's
And
right.
I love the whole movie, but I so enjoyed watching the woman who showed us the history of papyrus paper,
Yes.
where it comes from, and then to watch it be put together, and then to watch her
Yes.
scribe on top of it.
Yes.
And to me, it was just kind of like a metaphysical kind of thing.
Yeah.
God's word, God knew not to use the paper time, because we would recycle it and go on. He used something that is so difficult and laborious to put together, but that can withstand the test of time.
Yes. And expensive. One thing that I think I mentioned many times before, that the oldest manuscripts, there's no space between words. Why? That takes a lot more paper by the time you get done. So you know where, if I did it in English, you'd know where the words end, because where they're supposed to end. So, but they did that. So yes, I think it's a providence that God did that. And then they used animal skin, which was very expensive in the 4th century. These were not things. So yes, and I also, Terry, the point that Terry alludes to, I'll just echo that one. If you want to doubt the veracity of the New Testament, fine. But don't go to any philosophy class and study Plato and have any dependence that what you're actually reading is really what Plato said. I mean, let's just be fair. Because if you compare the textual evidence for Plato's writings or some of the Roman histories from the Caesars and all of that, if you want to study those and believe that we actually have some accurate information, that's great. But compared to the New Testament, it's not even close to being as well tested too as the New Testament. There are 1,000-year gaps. The oldest stuff we have is, So anyway, that's a great point too. Alan.
I guess I'm back because I didn't go see the movie.
Yeah, no, that's all right.
So, back up.
You'll see it some of the yeah.
The first question was, who was the guy that was writing all the stuff that's counteracting the writings?
Bart Airmen.
Bart Airmen.
Yeah.
So Bart Airmen, what's his purpose?
What is his purpose? Nice.
My point is going to be this: okay, if you have all these errors that he's claiming, I guess, then we don't have any scriptures to base on. So I would have to tend to think that his relationship was more a non-issue.
Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about him since I'm being pretty critical of him. Bart Ehrman's journey starts off in the Moody Bible Institute as an evangelical Christian, very conservative. Some people would say fundamentalist, or whatever. I mean, that's... Then he went into a more progressive, more liberal denomination of the Episcopal Church. And then he moved to being an agnostic, and he says that happened over the theodicy issue, over he couldn't explain why a good and all-powerful God could allow all the suffering and whatnot. I listen to Bart, and I know he's kind of sincere, but there are people who have a personality that are, I call it iconoclasts. What's an iconoclast? Anybody know what it is?
Somebody that breaks down an icon. Yeah.
Somebody that breaks icons. Back in the Reformation, people went around destroying icons, and so there are people who love to destroy people's sacred things. It's just, I don't know, they get a thing out of it. And when I listen to him, he has got an axe to grind, and I don't know whether it's hurt, what's going on. I'm not going to psychologize him, but he's very sincere. He says, I poured through these things, and I want to know, can I be dependent? And he says, my conclusion is you can't be dependent. You can't depend on the New Testament. And of course, and on and on. So, I feel for the guy. He still teaches at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He's one of their primary biblical scholars and New Testament teachers. So, but he's not alone. He's just echoing what's really become the prevailing viewpoint, I suppose. Do you want to keep going, and then I'll go back? Yeah.
Except on that, my understanding and belief is one of, we do have the Bible. The Bible only works with the Holy Spirit within you to interpret anything that's going to come across. So it doesn't really, even Satan alone, he understands the Bible very clearly.
Yeah.
Obviously doesn't have an effect. So it still has that relationship with Jesus Christ with the Word that makes the Word precious.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's just an empty book.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who know the Bible inward and outward, but it's God the Holy Spirit that works through that. Dave, I see Dave, and then back here. Yeah, so we'll go here and then to Dave. Yep.
I think overall the movie showed me the accuracy of the translation to Greek, the Greek Bible. However, it did not carry on the translation to American English, and what choice of what words did we use in the translation of that. And that's in all the Bible studies that I've been part of, is why did we choose that phrase or that type of word for that initial Greek statement.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. Another step could be, sitting down with the New Testament, one of the many New Testament scholars who worked on the New Revised Standard Version, or and like, why did you use that word? And, that would be a great thing. Do know, though, that our namesake, Martin Luther, when everybody says Luther translated the Bible, Luther and Philip Melanchthon and a whole cadre of other people translated the Bible. Yes, Luther was the main force, and he created a language, the German language in essence. It was so scattered and mixed up, and he unified the German language into his translation. But it was a group project. Every one of, except for the Message, Eugene Peterson, that's kind of his thing. But most of your translations, your NIV, your RSV, your New Revised Standard Version, your English Standard Version, these are all group projects. There's a whole committee that sits down and painstakingly looks at the Greek and then says, okay, what's the best way to put this grammar? And there are two kinds of translations. There's ones that are dynamic equivalents. Those are ones like the Message. He's not concerned about getting every word translated correctly. he's trying to say, what's the overall meaning in English, and then he gives it to you. And so it's a helpful translation. You should always have a literal translation, though, like the NRSV, the NIV, ESV, etc. So let me just see if I can show you. Let's just do this. I'll just float this panel right here. So what I can do, fortunately with technology, is I can do an interlinear, which I know that looks really scary to you, but it does. So all that does is it puts the Greek word underneath. And you can buy one of these yourself. So if then there is any encouragement in Christ, this is Philippians 2, any consolation from love, and it gives you, here's the Greek that's translated into those words. So, you know, their tools are there to see how, you know, people translate things. So anyway, but yeah, so Bob's right to mention that. But I want to use his comment to tell you that, you know, there's whole committees that are behind these translations. How many of you have a Bible that has 3 or 4 translations in it side by side? Those are great tools. Those are great tools. A lot of times when I talk about this stuff, people go, well, I don't know Greek. I guess I can't. No. You are more equipped than any Christian, probably at any time, when it comes to the Scriptures. Because you have all these translations. And you can read them. And you can put them side by side. You don't need to know Greek. What you need to know is that a lot of very faithful people worked very hard so that your English Bible, you know, is... I can remember an airplane conversation with a gal who, this was about 10 years ago, he said, oh, well, the Bible, you can't, you know, that's just, there's copies of copies, and it's what human beings said it meant, and, you know, and this was her belief. I wanted to go, before we go to Dave, I want to go back one to Alan when you talked about Bart Ehrman. I just want to make it, because I don't want to, you know, I'm upset about Bart Ehrman's position. Who he is and what I don't know his position and what, but I will say this. Everybody has skin in the game. You know, and I guess I should have all of our college-bound kids and all the college kids sitting here right now, and I try and get to them. And say the comparative religion professor is honest and sincere as they are, and it's a good class, go take it. But when you have instructors who are undermining, you know, either your faith or the New Testament, they're not just simply coming out as, I just want the truth, I want to be completely objective. No, they have an agenda. Everybody has skin in the game. Because if the Bible isn't in charge, who is?
Romans calls us to avoid some of those people that try to subvert.
Yeah. So, and sometimes that's a good strategy. You just need to say, I'm just going to, you know, you only listen to Bart Ehrman for so long. I listened to his YouTube. I mean, he's got 100,000 million likes. He's got, you could watch YouTube videos of Bart Ehrman for at least a week without stopping. You go to YouTube. So. But I don't recommend you do that. But if you want to listen to some of it, it's good. It's a good challenge. We should have our faith refined. But what I want to say is, you know, people have an axe to grind. Because if God is not in control, who is? I am. So if you know, so just everybody comes at it. You know, nobody is perfectly unbiased. I just want the truth. Because they're always criticizing religious people. Well, you're just biased. Everybody has a bias that way. So I wanted to say that. Okay, Dave, and then we'll go here.
3 quickies.
Yeah.
At the end of the the end of the movie,
yes,
there was a Q&A session with the principals involved.
Right.
And it was during that time that they talked about Airmen, is it? Bart?
Yeah, Bart Ehrman. Yep.
But the principal in the movie said that he has debated him on several occasions.
Yep.
And that Airman had kind of like admitted it, maybe that's the wrong word, but indicated that, yeah, well, maybe it is correct or something, I've forgotten, but maybe you could comment on that.
Yep. Let me do that. Can you not? Let me do that so I don't forget. Basically, Bruce Metzger, who was like the main, one of the great Greek New Testament scholars responsible for all kinds of translations and worked with, was Bart Ehrman's instructor, and in one of their writings, Bart Metzger says, you know, all these variants, they call them textual variants, all these variants amount to almost no doctrinal changes, no significant things, and Bart Ehrman agreed with him, and he's on record with agreeing with him. But now he's written all these books, making big hay of this, making lots of. So that's what that guy was referring to. Yes.
Two other points. One, this is just an observation and doesn't probably mean much, but they kept showing during the movie clips of the two, I guess they were archaeologists or historians that discovered some of the original, walking in desert wear, I guess, kicking sand out in the middle of nowhere and uncovering this fragment coming up through the sand. So if it was being shown to somebody who was a skeptic, it might be, oh, come on, give me a break. How can they find this in the middle of the desert?
Yeah.
But then last point I wanted to make is that during that Q&A session, from some of the questions from the audience, the question was, what do you intend for us to take away from the movie? And do you think I can remember what they said? There were, I think, 2 points, and one may have been, I don't know, doing good for others or serving others, but I don't remember exactly. Hopefully somebody here does.
Yeah, that's a perfect question. I know we are, first of all, just to your second point, this is an archaeological dig that in Egypt, I forget, it's
Oxyrhynchus.
Yeah.
O-X-Y,
Yeah.
R-H-Y-N-C-H-U-S.
There you go. And my understanding is that a lot of the digs where they find this ancient city, it is a lot just simply sand that has over the century, and they are digging down. But it isn't quite like kicking some sand and then, but that picture was a little misleading, I think. But that would be a great question for Dr. Evans to say, can you give us actually how did this happen? I know that the way they talk about it is you get to different layers. And so they find something at a certain layer that's, you know, so I know it's more than just, you know, oops, I stumbled over a 2,000-year manuscript. That was good. So what do you take away? What's your takeaways? I'd like to, go ahead, Kevin, and then I'd like to hear some takeaways. So please.
One of the things from the movie, well, maybe not from the movie, but the shepherding of Scripture through the ages has been more a validation of what exists, whereas publish and perish in university systems is sort of like a circular firing squad where you validate everybody else's work and add a little.
Yeah.
And basically, it's not the same thing, but we're looking at it through the same lens.
Okay, good. Very helpful. What are your, please.
So much of that went right over my head.
Yep.
And I left and I'm commented to somebody, I'm not sure what I just saw. Because the language and stuff is not stuff I don't have a schema for that.
Right. Good.
But
good
one
point.
thing.
Other people made that point. I know I talked to some other people that said, I just went off my head.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, and I'm not sure if I even got this correct, was that they said there were 3 kinds of manuscripts. One was the book rolls, and then they said they found that one basket with 6 of them down in the 3rd strata. I thought that was kind of impressive. And then the codex, which is the bound one, and then they have the flat ones.
Yeah.
And did I get this correct, that who reads them or uses them is determines whether they do the rolls, the codex, or the flat? I don't know if I got that information. Probably not even important.
No, one thing I want to hold up is that I didn't know, that I learned in this movie, is that most of the writings in antiquity and going back to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, the writings were in scrolls. The Old Testament, they were always in scrolls. Individual books. So the individual scrolls that represented the book, like the great Isaiah scroll that they found in the Dead Sea, it wasn't attached. There wasn't the rest of the Old Testament. It was a separate scroll. Christian writings. So I think they said something like 15% of the writings of those centuries were books, like we have, like this, a codex. Christians, 85% were books. Christianity put the form of the book on the map. They made that point. Codex Vaticanus Sinaiticus is a book form, not just a bunch of separate scrolls. Some of our papyri that we have, we don't know because it's just such a small fragment whether it was in a book. What I looked at in the Chester Beatty Museum, they're leaflets, and you can see the holes where the bindings were. So we know that was a book. That's a New Testament book going back to 200 to 250 AD. So it existed. We don't have the entire book together like we do with the Vaticanus, but we can see that this was a book. So the one thing that I want you to get that you mentioned is that Christianity really put the book form, the codex, on the map because it wasn't used that much. So that this is a little bit reaction to what you have to share. What are your takeaways? Sue, you're not alone. There's a lot of language, and I hope when this comes out you'll look at it, because this is one of those things that only so much sticks. But what are your takeaways? Yes, and then Kim, Brent up here. Yeah.
So, and the discrepancies on it during the movie and everything, a thought came in my head, and it keeps coming into my head, is that when I studied music and studied opera, the main reason they don't reinterpret operas out of the original language is they can't.
Yes.
Because they can't get it to rhyme, they can't get it to say what was said in the original text.
Yep.
So they do them always in the original language. Some people interpret it with scrolls and in English, but they can't really interpret it. And I think down through history, going from one language to another, I think it goes back to intent. That the scholar's real intent was to get the best interpretation you can, that the language limited that.
Yes. You bring up an important point, Ron. It is hard to translate from one language to another. We do it all the time. Books are translated, but you do lose a little something. But what I'm convinced of after knowing just enough Greek to get my way around, a Greek dictionary and thesaurus, is that if you take all the different English translations, some of the dynamic ones, you can really get a huge 98% of what was there in the other language. But yes, it won't rhyme. Here's the best example. The Psalms, they're all poems. How do you translate poetry to where you can translate the meaning of the words in poem, but can't make it rhyme? So that's a good point. What are your takeaways? So that people who didn't see the movie might say, I might go see that someday. Yeah.
So I think what he said, the main theme of the movie is that you can trust the content of the Bible.
Yes.
That it's, if not exact, it's very darn close to what the original writings were.
I think that's what he said was the big takeaway. One of the big takeaways, yeah. Others? Any others? Right here, Sue, yep. And then, we got to quit. Yep, after Sue, yep, I'll just sum it up. I'm not Sue.
I was impressed with how valuable the people thought these were. The writing was so painstaking, everything was done perfectly by hand on these papers they had to make, and then the ink they had to make. And so when a manuscript was done, it was very valuable and preserved. And the climate, of course, helped that in our climate, maybe they would have rotted away.
Yep.
But in the dryness of the desert, these manuscripts were saved, and you said used for many, many years.
Yep.
But they were so valuable.
Yes, absolutely.
And so revered that they did that.
That's a great It's a great point. I'll finish off by telling you that Codex Sinaiticus is named that way because it was found in a small monastery on one of the proposed sites of Mount Sinai. And it was tucked away. It had been there for, we found it 100 years ago. And it dates back to the 400s. So it's been around for 1,500 years in that little monastery or somewhere. Maybe eventually, maybe for a couple hundred years it was used around, but it gets put in that monastery. They have got lots of other Bibles and lots of things, but it sits there for that long, and we find it just 100 years ago. So yeah, they did revere these. And,
God is good, and He drags it out just when we need it.
yeah, that's right. And so I'll finish with this just little statement. Yes, my takeaway is I want you to know that your English translation is a very, very, very good reflection of the originals and of the Greek manuscripts that we have, and you can be very confident in that. That's a huge takeaway. Thank you for my sabbatical. Thank you for that opportunity. If you ever get a chance to look at one of these old papyrus manuscripts, do it. I mean, I don't want to be too like, woo, but I know I told you this story. I came back from sabbatical. I'll tell it to you again just to finish this off. So when I was at the Chester Beatty Museum, I pulled Sandy and Becca and Katie over. I pulled out my English translation on my phone, and because what they had on display that day, I was just very fortunate, was Philippians 2:4 and following, which is this great Christ hymn. Most scholars believe that Paul's bringing in an ancient Christian creed. That's what I recited to you, have this mind in yourself that's in Christ Jesus. Most likely, it's in poetry form. So you can see that in your English Bible. Most of your English Bibles all of a sudden changes from prose to lines for poetry. So most likely this is one of the oldest confessions of faith in Christianity, going back right from the beginning. And Paul brings it into his letter of Philippians. And so I'm standing in front of this little piece of papyrus that dates back to 250 AD, the oldest segment of that Pauline letter, looking at probably the oldest creed of the Christian faith. And I stood there and I literally wept. Because that, I can look it up in my logos. I've got a separate little deal that gives me the Greek of that translation. So what I want you to know is that don't let anybody tell you that somehow you've had the wool pulled over your eyes. A lot of people don't need to know all of this. But I'm telling you that because I'm seeing a lot of people's faith shaken when they get down and they start to see how this New Testament is put together. Because there's a lot of people that are spinning it in a way that tells you you can't be penal. So I think you should be equipped with that. And anyway, so thank you for going to the movie. When it comes out, we'll show it again. Fragments of Truth. It was well done. It's a beautiful job. All right, beautiful. So next week, I'm on vacation. So, but we will have class. We'll have something else set up for you. So, but next Sunday I'm not here. So anyway, after that, we'll finish up to the summer with our New Testament culture. Thank you.